Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur. I hope that you're doing well. I hope you're having a great week. It is Tuesday, which means it is time for a Tag Tuesday book tag, and it's going to be the Reading Band Books tag, which was originally created by Brian over at Bookish, who kindly tagged me in his video, and I'll link that video in the description box below. And a lot of people have been embracing this tag, which it's fortunate that people are embracing it, but it's really disheartening that this is even a timely topic, that this is not only going on, because it's gone on for centuries, in the US, outside of the US, it is certainly occurred across the past 36 years of my life, 35 years of my lifetime. But it's been accelerating. And it's been accelerating at a local and regional level where there are people, trying to get books out of classrooms, off shelves, out of the hands of all these kids that are going to negatively influence. And it should be noted that these aren't books that are glamorizing violence. These aren't books that are glamorizing racial violence or sexual violence. They're not doing that. They are noting that it occurred, that it is occurring. And they are examining voices that often have been victims or have been silent in so many other great classics. So it's very disheartening that this is a timely topic. And a lot of people have been showing some absolutely fantastic books, real masterpieces. Two I would note, of course, are two that have been targeted, certainly in the US. The Bluest by Toni Morrison and Beloved by Toni Morrison, probably the single greatest work of fiction written in the US. The Bluest maybe is the greatest debut novel written in the US. Another that, a real old school banned book, one that I dearly love, would be Gargantua and Pantagruel by Rabelais. This was banned well over 100 years ago. And this is a real masterpiece if you've never read it. But I want to take it in a different direction. A lot of people have noted books that have been banned and, are being taken off shelves. But there's a different type of book that gets banned. And that's kind of what I want to focus on in this video. I'm going to show a couple of books that were banned not after they were published, but before they were published. Books that weren't allowed to be published in the lifetime of their writers. Because I think that's a different type of banning. And to me, that's a more pernicious and sinister type of ban. It's one thing to have a book that gets banned after it's been published, because as Fichte notes, he was a German idealist philosopher, nothing true or useful can ever really be removed from humanity once it has entered the world. It's out there, it has influenced people, and so it can't ever really be ripped out of the human consciousness and culture, despite the best efforts of many. And there's also a real difference between books that aren't being published because their writers were terrible people or did terrible things or are glamorizing violence and misogyny and things like that. That's a whole different subject. I'm talking about people who couldn't get their books published because they made people feel uncomfortable. So let's take a look at one that I think a lot of people are familiar with. That would be The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. This is a massive satire of really the totalitarian state that existed under Stalin in the Soviet Union. And Bulgakov wrote this knowing it would never be published in his lifetime. As he was writing it, some of his peers, some of his colleagues, people he had known, seen at events or public functions, were being tortured and murdered. He didn't want to encounter that. He didn't want that to happen to his family. So he was writing this one for the drawer. It was later published after his death. And of course, it's a masterpiece. Loads of people view it as a masterpiece and maybe one of the single greatest works to come out of the Soviet Union. But it couldn't be published during his own lifetime. Another would be Romance in Marseille by Claude McKay. And I don't know why this one wasn't published. This only came out recently in 2020, despite having been written in the 1930s. It's a wonderful book. I don't know if it wasn't published primarily because of the different portrayals of LGBTQ characters. There are this book to a large degree feels like it could have been written in 2017 or 2019 with the very sympathetic, empathetic, honest portrayals of characters, both male and female characters who are homosexual or bisexual, are finding love in all sorts of different non-traditional relationships. And McKay himself was bisexual, and that shows on the page. It is a book that feels like it's very modern because the sensibilities don't feel hidebound. They don't feel strained. He has a real love for his characters, and his characters are allowed to love each other. They're not ashamed of who they are. They're not ashamed of the love they have for each other. And so maybe that's why this book was never published, because Claude McKay could get published. Home to Harlem is in the Library of America as a Harlem Renaissance classic. He was a well-regarded poet. This book, though, wonderful as it is, this beautiful portrayal of life, on the coast of France, couldn't get published. Another recent publication, this one from the actual Library of America, and one I've been reading this week would be The Man Who Lived Underground from Richard Wright. And I'm almost certain I know why this one wasn't published. This came in the aftermath of Richard Wright writing Native Son and publishing Native Son, which created certainly a lot of controversy. Native Son is a book that's been banned. But The Man Who Lived Underground is an even more dynamic portrayal of police brutality, Native Son isn't so much a portrayal of police brutality, but it sort of demands this idea of how much does the society in which Bigger Thomas is born and existing, how much does that society affect the violence that he ultimately commits? Not so much the violence towards a white character early in the novel, but the violence towards his black girlfriend later on. This book really does get into the idea of police brutality, of a character being set up for a crime he didn't commit, being tortured, and then ultimately, almost in a Ralph Ellison Invisible Man type way, going and living underground in sort of the sewers underneath Chicago, and has a dynamite ending, a real apocalyptic ending. That's why this book wasn't allowed to be published. It was redacted down to a tiny short story that was maybe a quarter of the length, probably less than a quarter of the length of the actual novel. And it was just the middle section. All of the violence at the beginning and end was totally stripped away. All of the sort of raw portrayals of racial violence that Wright had encountered. Wright had an uncle who was lynched. And so he was very well aware of what could happen. That's raw and on the page right here in The Man Who Lived Underground. This was only recently published after, again, 80 years of not being allowed to really be seen. Ralph Ellison, by the way, loved what he was able to read of it. And I think he was inspired by Invisible Man. One last one that I want to mention before I shift to another idea would be writers like Steve Biko, who, because this now shifts to the first three were writers who were able to publish some things, but not others because of the ideas being too dangerous or too subversive or making publishers feel uncomfortable, that there wouldn't be an audience for it. I think to another degree, we have writers who were sort of just flat out, their voices were silenced by their lives being silenced and murdered. Steve Biko would be an example of that, where in South Africa, he was just murdered. That's why we don't have more works of the political thought of Steve Biko. Patrice Lumumba, so many other key human beings, key thinkers, and members of the global society of the 20th century, people with real ideas, experiences that gave them deep human perspectives and a clear ability to rise above circumstances. Their voices were silenced because their lives were silenced. And so I think that's another type of banned book that we don't have. So that we don't get to read that even after their lifetime, that it's suddenly safe to publish. It's just not allowed. And then one last category would be the writers who were sort of, their future works ended up being in a sense banned because they were never allowed to be cultivated. And Virginia Woolf gets at this idea in her essay, A Room of One's Own, which is another wonderful masterpiece. But someone like Nella Larsen, we don't have the late works of a mature Nella Larsen, later in her life. We don't have, her King Lear. We don't have her Paradise Lost, Samson Agonistes, all those works that come from writers much later in life, Oedipus at Colonus from Sophocles. Because Nella Larsen really couldn't, she wasn't being supported as a writer to be able to continue developing. What we have, Quicksand and Passing, are wonderful books. But I would like to think that Larsen had so much more to share with our culture, with our society, with the human imagination. I'd like to think that Gene Toomer did as well. And when he was not being allowed to be published as a writer and was being forced to be published only as a black writer with Kane, he really, and that was how he was being introduced on every publication. He couldn't feel that he had more that he wanted to share with the world. And I know he did, because he was, he had that imaginative spirit and that fire to create real wonderful works of art. So those are the types of banned books I wanted to focus on in this video. I'm sure there are so many others that you guys can think of. Please let me know, especially if there are works that ended up being published later on. I love these types of books. I love getting my hands on them. I love being able to see just how much people in the past were able to think ahead of what we even think of now. So hope everybody's doing well. Thank you.